Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to the Building State Capability Talk Series. Today, my name is Salimah Samji, and I will be your moderator. I am the Executive Director of Building State Capability. We're delighted today to have Greg Power with us. Greg is the founder and board chair of Global Partners Governance and the author of Inside the Political Mind, the Human Side of Politics and How It Shapes Development. I mean, how pertinent is that topic given the world we live in today? So we are extra delighted to have Greg with us at this time. He has been a special advisor to the UK Minister Robin Cook and Peter Hain. He has been involved in constitutional and democratic changes since the mid-1990s, and since 2005, his organization, Global Partners Governance Practice, has helped to strengthen political systems across Asia, the Middle East, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, and Central and Eastern Europe. He has worked in the weeds of politics in more than 60 countries, helping politicians and officials find solutions to today's problems while building the resilience of their institutions. Welcome, Greg. We are really honored to have you with us today. I just want to give all of you who are here a sense of how this presentation is going to go. Greg is going to start off by doing a presentation on his book and sharing some key insights. I will then, as moderator, ask him a few questions, and then we will take questions from all of you. If you have questions while Greg is speaking or at any point, please feel free to use the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we will basically pick the questions from there and ask Greg. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg. Greg, welcome again, and I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Salimah, thank you very much. And apologies to you all that I'm not actually with you. As Salimah knows, I've been trying to get to you physically for about 9 months and have just failed for all sorts of reasons, but this was the next best thing. So thank you for having me. What I'll do is I'll dive straight into the presentation. I will aim to talk for sort of 20, 25 minutes. Salimah, if I'm talking for too long, please do interrupt and stop me, because there is a risk that I could just keep talking unless I'm stopped. So, as Salimah mentioned, the presentation is about the content of my book, which came out last year, called Inside the Political Mind, and that book was pretty much an attempt to try and capture some of the stuff that we have been doing. As Salimah mentioned, I started off my career in British politics, worked in the British government, and since 2005, I've been working internationally. We've done sort of mainly worked with parliaments and political parties, but also with ministers and civil servants, and worked with a whole variety of aid agencies and implementers right across the world. The book was an attempt to try and capture some of the insights from some of that work, but also it's partly a criticism of the way of a lot of international work has been done when it comes to politics. And I obviously exclude the Building State Capability Programme from this, because we think very much alike on these subjects, but an awful lot of international support to politicians and to political institutions tends to focus much more on process than it does on people. And my experience of working in more than 60 countries has reinforced the fact, or two facts. Firstly, every single country in which we've worked is different. They all have their own specific peculiarities and differences. But the more you work with politicians, the more you start to see some of the commonalities as well. And the key thing is that politicians are human beings, and when you're working with them, they behave like human beings quite a lot of the time, and that often gets in the way of sensible reform for reasons which I will explain. And I'll start to try and capture some of this with an analogy about traffic. Now, wherever you are in the world, the rules of the road, in theory, the highway code as you'd have it in the UK, or the rules for driving, are pretty similar wherever you are. And going to any country, you broadly understand the stop signs look pretty similar wherever you are. They all conform to the same sort of basic principles. The road furniture will be the same. You'll have a green man to tell you when to cross the road and when not to cross the road. The junctions you see, you'll have white lines down the middle of the road. You'll have those sorts of junctions. You'll have stop signs. You'll have traffic lights. However, given all those similarities, learning how to drive in another country is far less about these formalities than it is about the human beings who are inside the cars. Because then you get to somewhere like Cairo, and I have a lot of, my wife is from Cairo, so I have a lot of affection for the place. But it's also, if any of you have been stuck in traffic jams in Cairo, it is an inordinately frustrating place to be stuck in a traffic jam. And when you first get there, the traffic doesn't seem to make any sense whatsoever. All the rules which I thought were normal when I got to Cairo didn't seem to apply at all. But the more you're there, the more you start to see the patterns emerge. You start to see the logic that has emerged from all of these drivers interacting with each other millions of times on a daily basis. And norms start to evolve. You start to understand how you drive in this place. And as I say, learning how to drive in a different city is far less about what the formal rules say than it is about the norms of driving that have evolved through all of those millions of interactions. And what that highlights is the difference between what the rules say and what the rules mean in practice. So, as I say, the road furniture will always look the same wherever you are, but the norms will have developed over a period of time and a logic starts to emerge. The problem with that, as that last bullet point highlights, is that none of this improves the traffic. And often it makes it worse. And I've encountered it. I mean, I'm using Cairo as an example because I know it very well, but I had similar experience in Delhi, in Nairobi, in Kuwait City, where invariably I've been in a taxi and said to the taxi driver, well, the driving looks very difficult here. And the response I always get is, oh, it's perfectly safe, provided by a pause. And then provided you know how to drive here. And it's that question, provided you know how to drive here, which is key to understanding this. Just to use another example, if any of you have been to another city, the first point at which you try to cross a road at a pedestrian crossing for the first time, you often will not know whether the traffic is going to stop for you until you put your foot into the road. But everybody there does know it. It's understanding the assumptions and the insights and the norms to which driving and traffic conforms in each of the different places. The problem, as I say in that last bullet point, is that this process of driving will make sense in the short term. What it doesn't do, though, is improve the traffic, and it often makes it worse. And the parallel here with politics is very applicable. That photo is from Tanzania. We were working with some politicians in Tanzania, and this is just outside Dar es Salaam. I spent some time with the MP there, going around his constituency, and it was him who said, "What else can I do?" In the context of what he said was that, look, I know some people coming to me today. If I don't give them any money, they're not going to eat. So what else do I do in that situation? He said, I know it doesn't solve the problem. I know these people are going to have to come back to me in a day, a week, a month's time. And they'll go and tell their friends as well. And their friends will come to me. So I'm increasing demand without the ability to increase supply. But what else can I do? And that's the logic of politics. That's the logic of traffic. In the same way that drivers in dysfunctional traffic systems will find ways around the system, so too do politicians. Where the state is weak, politicians will be expected to fill the gaps. And they'll often, the only way they can do that is by going around the formal system, because the formal system doesn't work. They'll have to find workarounds. They'll have to, most of the politicians that we've worked with around the world will spend a lot of their time, as this Tanzania MP did, giving people money, finding them jobs, paying for their hospital bills, paying for their kids' tuition fees. They have to find ways of fixing the problems because they're expected to do it, but also because the state is failing to do it. What happens then is a logic sets in. Those interact in the same way that the interactions between drivers start to set the norms. So voters come to prize those traits in their politicians. And elections are competitions between voters who are best able to get around the system and fix the problems that their constituents need fixing. What many elections end up being is quite literally MPs proving their worth to their politicians. They have to show that they have the means to help their citizens or can get access to those funds, that money, those resources, have the ear of the minister in order to fix those problems. And they're competing on that basis for votes because that's what voters want. But none of this addresses the underlying problems. And the catch-22 is that it's expensive, inefficient, and largely ineffective. Most of the politicians that I've worked with doing the constituency work, there's a double-edged sword for this work in that they get almost most of their rewarding stuff that they do is in helping people locally because they're often facing very, very serious problems. And there's a huge sense of personal reward if you can give somebody money so that you make sure that they eat, or if you can find them a house, or if you can give them access to the benefits that they need, or get their kids into a school. That will give you a sense of fundamental reward as a human being. What it doesn't do is solve the problem in the long run. And the book explains at some length, how this constituency work is a useful thing to understand about what motivates politicians, why they do what they do, and as I'll come on to, how you might address some of that. The challenge and the distinction I make in the book, I think there are three key points to make, three key principles around which the book is built. The first is understanding the difference between what the rules say and what the rules mean. As I said, a lot of international assistance in this space tends to focus on what the rules say, but spends much less time on what the rules mean. Secondly, there's the importance of the human factor. Ultimately, the way in which systems function is down to what motivates individual human beings, and you need to understand what's motivating those human beings in order to understand why the system is working the way that it does. And thirdly, what you end up with is systems or behavior which is entirely logical, but not very rational. And what I mean by that is that in the short term, as I said, the lessons of the drivers, if you're stuck in a traffic jam in the middle of Cairo, you will focus on what you need to do to get to your destination as quickly as possible today. If you asked any of those drivers in Cairo or Delhi or Nairobi, would you like a better traffic system which worked more effectively? They would only have one answer, which is, of course, yes. But that's the rational answer. But they're powerless to do that in the same way as the politicians faced with a state that doesn't function properly. You're largely powerless to do much about that in the short term. You have to fix problems today. You have to get to your destination today. And so you do what is logical. Even though by doing this, you're making many of the systems work. The politicians that we've worked with will recognize that by going around the system, politicians in these sorts of contexts get good at going around the system, but arguably they're further undermining the ability of the state to actually strengthen its own structures and processes so that it can fix those problems in a more rational way. And that tension between what's logical and what's rational is what sits at the heart of the book. So the book then, the last part of the book tends to go through four broad principles and focusing on a much more behavioral approach to political reform. The first, and Matt Andrews' work was very useful when I started thinking about all of this probably a decade or so ago, and I very much enjoyed his book on the limits of institutional reform in development. And the book itself highlights the number of international interventions, which tends to focus on form rather than function, on process rather than people. And the example I use in the book, having been to Afghanistan about a decade ago, you could argue that by many standards, the international interventions in Afghanistan were highly successful in that they created almost exactly the constitutional architecture and the institutional furniture that the international community was trying to create. What they failed to do was take the people inside those buildings with them. So although the institutions of politics had changed in Afghanistan, the culture of politics hadn't changed at all. People kept doing exactly what they had been doing, just in slightly different surroundings and, slightly more efficient in a slightly more efficient way. That's the problem. I mean, there are, as I say in that last bullet point there's what is often good on paper is not so good in practice. Just because you've changed the structure of the institution doesn't mean that people's behavior is going to change. A lot of the patterns of political behavior in most of the countries in which we work are deeply embedded in the culture, the norms, the social expectations of what the local leaders should do, and these often predate the introduction of formal political institutions. And what you've got often is a very informal political culture trying to operate within the limits of formal institutional structures, and you get tensions at many levels there. So the key point and that first part of the first principle of change is that from John Cotter, is that change sticks when it becomes the way we do things around here. That all change is ultimately behavioral change. The point of changing an institution, changing a process, trying to change the formal structures is to provoke a different form of behavior, to improve the way that people are performing within those institutions, to get people better at their jobs, to encourage different patterns of behavior, new techniques, new skills, etc. So that's the first principle. The second then, and the book borrows quite heavily from from 3 or 4 different disciplines, from comparative politics, as will be evident, but also from behavioral economics and from change management in the business world. The behavioral economic stuff is really useful, and I've been talking to people in the behavioral insights team in London about some of this stuff. And what's striking is that an awful lot of the way that behavioral science is used in the international sphere in particular is often about getting the public to do things differently, to get people to eat different things or wash their hands more regularly, or hygiene, whatever it might be. It's very rarely applied to institutions and the process of institutional change. But there are huge insights from behavioral economics which are very useful here. And the key, I mean, I think the central thing to understanding how political institutions function, and I mean every organization, and the difficulty of change, is the power of loss aversion. Now, some of you will probably be familiar with some of the work that's been done by Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler and others about loss aversion and the willingness of people to take risks. And all these behavioral experiments tend to show that people are only willing to take a gamble or to take a risk if the benefits are roughly twice the value of what they might lose. So basically, in order to take a bet which is going to cost you $5, you have to win at least $10. So you're potentially doubling what you've got. But the problem with a lot of behavioral economic stuff is that because it's economics, it tends to focus on money as the main currency. But in politics, the stuff that's at stake when change is in the air is in many ways much more important than money. It's about everything that defines you as a politician. It's to do with power, authority, status. And in many of the places in which we have worked, the challenge, we've had conversations with senior politicians who just did not want to contemplate the prospect of change because of the risks that it might bring with it. They weren't even willing to engage with the pros and cons of the individual reforms. It was just the fact that there was a chief whip that I worked with in the UK who I had a conversation with about some of this stuff about the importance of reform, and went with what I thought were really useful, insightful arguments to persuade him. And at the end of my long, efforts to persuade him to support these reforms, he just looked at me and said, "Yeah, look, we know the system's not perfect, but we know how to operate it." And he said, essentially what he was saying was that, you know, the merits of these changes you're proposing are, absolutely, I'm not going to argue with them, but they come with a risk. And I'm not willing to take the risk because, at the moment, I know where my power is and I know how to use it. And I think the challenge of reform, the challenge of and the power of loss aversion is hugely underestimated. As many of you will know, change management from the business world, there's, libraries full of books on change management, most of which spend time explaining why change is so hard, why people do not like to change. Seems to be magnified when it comes to policy, because, as I say, what's at stake is to do with power, authority, status, everything which defines you as a politician or as a minister. What the book argues, and I go through the process of change in a number of different parliaments around the world, is that the successful reforms tend to be combining personal interest with a higher political principle. Whenever change is in the air, for everybody's first thought is, how is this going to affect me? That might not be the determining factor in whether you support the change or not, but it's always your first thought. How am I going to be affected by this? And change initiatives need to start by understanding what change feels like when you're on the inside of an institution, and you need to persuade people that the change is going to benefit them personally, but also that they will be supporting a bigger, wider, broader political principle. The third principle in the book then is how you use reciprocal exchange as part of that reform process. There's an academic called Joel Barkan who did some really useful work on the development of African parliaments during the early 2000s, and his analysis of the Kenyan parliament was very interesting. What he did was that he argued that, well, the process of reforming the Kenyan parliament was one which went from the Kenyan parliament went from one of the weakest parliaments on the African continent to one of the strongest in the space of about 10 years, which is a remarkably quick turnaround for that sort of change to happen. And it was largely down to a guy called Oluwaringo, who had been a minister, but became a reforming MP, working against the government in which he had been a minister. And his insight was that you needed to appeal to both the reforming side and the opportunistic side of politicians' brains in order to get that change to happen. He recognized that for the parliament to strengthen itself, it needed to have its own budget because it was entirely dependent on money coming from government to start with. And for as long as it was dependent on that government money, it couldn't really control its own agenda or its work or employ its staff. However, he also knew that there was a level of self-interest involved in this. Namely, if the parliament could get hold of the budget and control the budget, it could then determine how much MPs were paid. And he played on both of these things. As I said in the previous slide, the argument was both to do with self-interest and political principle. There was a principle involved that Parliament should have the ability to control its own budget, but secondly, there was an element of self-interest, which is we can pay ourselves more, we can have more researchers, we can get better offices, all those sorts of things. Now, in Kenya, as some of you will be aware, at one point, Kenyan MPs were amongst the best paid in the world as a result of this. So it's not an unalloyed success, but it did achieve what Oringo was after, in that the parliament did dramatically strengthen itself. And the book talks through a number of different examples from the political world about how politicians have used the process of reciprocity, of negotiation, of trade-offs, in order to appeal to both of those sides of the political brain, to both the altruistic and the egotistic at the same time. And the Cialdini book is if any of you want to read it, is a cracking book on how to persuade people. His first principle being one of reciprocity, but it was summed up for me by that quote at the bottom. I was working with the Irish Parliament in the early 2000s, and the chief whip of that Parliament, when I asked him how he had successfully driven through a whole series of reforms quite quickly, looked me squarely in the eye and simply said to me, you have to make sure that everybody gets something. You have to maximize the winners and minimize the losers if you're going to succeed in getting change to happen. And then the fourth principle, this is the last principle, is one again which draws heavily from behavioral economics. The principle of thinking big and acting small. I mean, the first time I heard that phrase, I was in Baghdad. We've been working with the government and the parliament in Iraq since about 2008. And when I was first there, I asked one of the people who'd already been there for a couple of years working with the Prime Minister's office, what advice would you give me, about how to get meaningful change here? And he said the thing, you have to think big, but act small. Progress is going to be slow. It's going to be difficult. It's going to be arduous. You need to be clear about the bigger objectives you're trying to get to. But in order to get there, you're going to have to take a huge number of very small steps in order to make this progress. And this was the Banerjee and Duflo work. I'm sure some of you will be familiar with, which really is built around this principle of trying to get small change in small spaces and then building it outwards. And that line really resonated with me, that first line about how international assistance is often structured, which is we shouldn't do anything unless we can do everything. I've spent the last 20 years talking to different aid agencies about the programs that they are trying to implement, and they always end up being, far too ambitious, far too unrealistic about what they might achieve, but they don't get funded unless they promise to change the whole political scene in the space of 3 to 5 years. But everyone knows they're not going to achieve that, but they have to promise it to start with. This sense that we shouldn't do anything unless we can do everything. It's much better to focus on the small stuff first. And it's, again, I borrowed from some of the work of the key people at the center of the Building State Capability program on some of those principles, those challenges that you have in international assistance of overambition, premature load bearing, and political resistance. They are always underestimated when it comes to international assistance, trying to do stuff in the governance and political sphere in most of the places in which we've worked. As one Iraqi MP said to me, when we first started doing that, as I mentioned, we were there. We started working there in 2008, and USAID at that time were running a project with the Parliament, which I think had a budget of about $35 million a year, I think. And the Parliament was filled with implementers from different agencies scurrying around trying to get things done, and the Iraqi MP says, "Look, we've got no control over this. It feels like we're the ones that are being implemented," and there was a limited amount of lasting effect because of that sort of approach. The last thing I mentioned, I'll wrap this up in a minute. The last thing I mentioned, the Scott book is a cracking book, Seeing Like a State, and I mean just generally, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with his work, but the idea of metis, which he talks about in the book, is a really useful one for understanding how politics develops, how it works, why it works when it does work, and why it doesn't when it doesn't. This idea of metis is it's often translated a Greek word which is often translated as cunning. The way that he interprets it is metis is the sort of skill that you develop by engaging with a constantly moving terrain. So the example he uses, for example, is if you're trying to learn to sail a boat, there is one thing to be learning, the techniques of how you sail, how you get the sail up, how you use the rudder. The metis comes in reading the waves and the weather and the wind and anticipating what's going to happen. It's like playing any sport. If you're playing football or basketball or any sport, you're engaging with a constantly moving opponent. So it's one thing to learn how to dribble a basketball or kick a football, but it's something else to anticipate what the people you're playing against are going to do and how you counter that. And that's metis. The metis is essential to being an effective politician. And it's hugely underestimated. Those sorts of skills that you build up over time by engaging with your subject, by engaging with difficult topics, by engaging with something which is constantly moving. The best politicians are the ones that have that metis. So to wrap up very quickly, those four principles, just to reiterate, the key to the reforms are people over process. That it's individuals over institutions. Understand what the institution looks like from the inside. What does it look like through the eyes of the politician or the minister? Secondly, if you're going to try and get change, it's no good solely appealing to principle. You need to recognise that personal interest will always have an effect on how people approach their own principles. Thirdly, the importance of reciprocity as a key element of reform. And then fourthly, get the small things right. And if I was going to leave you with one final thought, it's that from Rory Sutherland, who, as it says there, is vice chairman at Ogilvy, the advertising agency, who points out in that book, which is again a very entertaining book, you should never denigrate a behavior until you've worked out what purpose it really serves. And a huge amount of international assistance still doesn't do that. It still is based on walking into other countries and saying, you're doing this wrong. Why are you behaving like this? This doesn't make sense. You need to start by working out why it does make sense to the people who are doing it, because there will always be a logic there and you just have to find it. And I'll finish there. Salimah, back to you.
Thank you so much, Greg. That's been really great. We at Building State Capability often say policy is about people. We talk about how change is hard, and we do talk about personal interests. So I really love your whole point on humans are logical, but not rational. Sometimes we like to explain, especially the last point you made. I love that quote. Status quo prevails for a reason. It's not, you can call it unfair, you can call it whatever you want, but it prevails for a reason. And understanding why, who is getting what out of the status quo really helps you start to peel that onion, if you will, of what is really going on. So I really appreciate this. We are living at a time, and I had said that earlier in my intro, of how great the timing is. I know we had wanted to have you in the fall and then that didn't work out, but I almost feel like this is much better for these times, the turbulent times and uncertain times we're living in, where the public sector is really under attack. Not necessarily just in the US, we see it in the ripple effects around the world. So what would you say about how one uses the insights and the four principles that you've developed to be able to think through this new world order that is continuing to change?
Yes, I mentioned this has come up in previous talks which I've done as well, and I still don't have a great answer for it, because it is so seismic. And I think I'd say three things in terms of the themes in the book. I guess there are three. The one is that the appeal of this sort of disruptive populism is, again, I think, logical but not rational. And if I take the example of Brexit in the UK and what's happened to British politics over the last decade, when we had the vote on whether to leave the European Union or not, lots of people assumed that vote was already won, that it would be absolutely nonsensical for the UK to leave the European Union. What they'd missed was the fact that for the previous 6 years, and actually since 2008, since the financial crisis, the government, in trying to balance the books, had implemented a policy of austerity, cutting benefits and reducing public spending. Now, this affected, if you're at the margins of society and weren't doing well to start with, you were most deeply affected by those cuts. By the time you get to 2016, after 8 years of this, and you're offered a vote, well, a lot of people were thinking, well, how much worse can my life get? Well, let's try something different. It's clear that, lots of people's living standards had declined. And there's some very interesting graphics which I've seen recently about productivity and real earnings in the UK over the last, well, since 2008, which really highlight the problem. But offered that vote, this might not be a rational, any rational argument would have said, the UK has to stay in the European Union. It would be nuts to leave. But the powerful logic of something which is very different at that point was absolutely appealing to a lot of people, and that's to a large extent I think the appeal of Trump as well, and a lot of the other populist leaders that you're seeing around the world, is that what we've lost sight of is that for a lot of people, their living standards have stalled or declined over the last 15 years, and faced with a choice of, well, do you want more of the same, or do you want something really different which might carry a risk with it? You're thinking, well, the risk is not that great for me because my life's not that great to start with, so let's take the risk. So that's the first point. The second point, and I'll try and compress this because I was going to try and answer this in more short order. I think the second point is that what you're seeing with the second Trump administration in particular is a deliberate disruption of the norms which have previously existed, which both Brexit and Trump 1 and now Trump 2 were the polarization which has emerged from that is a product of the fact that already the arguments were heated about on both sides of whether you supported Trump or against Trump, supported Brexit or not. But the disruption of those norms has made those arguments even more incendiary, in that both sides somehow feel the other side isn't playing fair. Especially true in Brexit, where the people who wanted to remain thought that the referendum was only won by a tissue of lies. The people who wanted to leave thought that the Remainers wanted to ignore a democratic referendum, and you can see parallels again in the States with Trump about it's not just a disagreement with the policies, but it's the way in which Trump is implementing those policies, which is clearly illegal in many respects, and ignoring the power of Congress and the law in order to get things done, like the abolition of US aid and various other things. That's what's heating stuff up to a point where it becomes really incendiary. In the book, at the beginning of the book, there's a short chapter about why parliaments fight. If anybody's interested, there's a website called Parliamentary Fights where you can go and watch MPs knocking lumps out of each other. And I use that as an intro to the book to explain, when the norms of normal interaction are being breached, that's when the fighting starts. That's when tensions really it goes from just an argument about policy to one which becomes much more personal and visceral. And then the third point, which sort of links to the book, is that the disruption of those the large part of the book is about how organizations depend on much more an acceptance of what the rules mean rather than what the rules say. In learning any job, you don't go in and read the rule book in order to learn how to do your job. You learn by watching what other people are doing and absorbing some of the patterns and the accepted norms and how you interact with each other. What the Trump government is doing is just throwing all those up in the air, which means that none of those institutions will work very effectively, if at all, for some time, because new norms will have to come in to determine how they function. So we're in for a period of prolonged turbulence, I think, whilst they did. But this is clearly their strategy, to deliberately disrupt how those institutions function, partly because the real, the sharpest effects of that disruption won't be felt probably until the end of this electoral term, possibly into the next electoral term, because that's the way that politics works. We'll start to really realize the damage, I think, in 2, 3, 4, 5 years' time, by which point, they will have new people to blame for why things went wrong. In the same way that in the UK, the people who supported Brexit are saying, well, no, it's not our fault. It's all to do with everything else that's going on. The reason that, we didn't get a proper Brexit. Anyway, I'll make those 3 points.
As you know, building state capability is housed at the Kennedy School of Government, and we train public policy professionals. What advice do you have for them, especially in this realm of politics? you hear a lot people say, oh, it's politics, it'll just work itself out, as though it's not even a variable to consider. And what you're saying, and a lot of our work tells you, is you can't not engage. Like you have to engage with politics if you're looking to get anything done. So what's your advice? What should students or alumni be thinking about? What skills should they think about sharpening to be able to be better policy professionals?
I go, oh, sorry, I should explain. Tell me if I'm looking slightly ghoulish. It's dusk. It's now got to about 6 p.m. So the sun has gone down. So this room has suddenly got. I didn't think to put lights on. If I need to put lights on, please tell me. I could look like a character out of Scooby-Doo if I'm not careful. The what I go back to is I mean, the feminist slogan of this sort of 60s and 70s that the personal is political. I think the political is always personal as well. It's if you reverse that, it's the fact that you're right, you have to engage with politics at every level if you are going to get stuff done, and you have to understand that the political is always personal. That, as I said in the talk, that politicians are human beings, and they behave like human beings with all the idiosyncrasies and odd things that human beings do. And I mean, my own personal experience is perhaps instructive because I studied politics, did a master's degree in political economy. I worked in the NGO sector, the think tank world for a few years. I ran a commission on how to reform the British Constitution and Parliament. Then went into government to work for a minister, a couple of ministers in the early 2000s, and went in thinking I had all the answers. I'd spent several years writing about this stuff from the safety of the think tank world, and suddenly realizing quite sharply that the stuff which looks fairly obvious and straightforward and sensible from the outside takes on a whole new level of complexity when you're on the inside of government. And it's far less to do with the intellectual cogency of your arguments than understanding the political interests at work. And at a very simple level, the ministers that I worked for absolutely believed in the reforms, which I was saying we should try and implement this. But what they wanted me to do was give them a briefing paper so they could go into the cabinet and explain to their fellow secretaries of state, the fellow ministers, why they should support that reform. And the argument often was, why should we make the government's life more difficult? We know how to function. We know how to run these things. At the moment, it's not perfect, but it works. So why on earth should we change things? And it's understand what would often happen is that politicians working on the reform of Parliament of Westminster and the House of Lords, what you'd often find is these odd objections which would come out of nowhere until you realise it was to do with just how they did their job. What happens with parliaments in particular and with politicians is that the biggest determinant of whether a parliament in any country is going to get stronger is whether politicians have an interest in making that parliament stronger. And that will often relate to how they do their job, because it's like anybody coming in interfering with your job description. How well, why should I do this? You're making my life more difficult. And I mean, the book explains a lot of this, but I think the key insight is that I think the sort of work that you do, and I mean, the Kennedy Center, but also building state capability, is invaluable stuff. But the acid test is then going inside a government, looking at what everything that you've learned from the inside of government, through the eyes of a minister or a senior civil servant, and understanding the things that they have to manage. I'm often asked to help NGOs and charities with their lobbying and influencing of government. And what I say to them is, the key rule of lobbying is, what does the world look like through the eyes of the person you're trying to influence? If you're going in to see a minister and want to change their mind, what does the world look like to them? What is it that matters to them? What motivates them? And what are they trying to manage today? Those three M's are really important. And you need to start every meeting with a minister or a senior official thinking about those three things. What matters, what motivates, what are they managing? Then the fourth question is, what have I got that is going to help them with all of those things? And that's my experience of working for ministers was that, a ministerial day is filled with meetings from 8 in the morning till 8 in the evening, most of which involve people coming in and saying, you're doing it wrong. You need to spend more money. You're not taking this seriously enough. You need to do what we think is important. The rare meeting where somebody comes in and says, look, we think we've spotted a problem that you haven't seen, but we can help you fix it. You will take the hand off. You will invite them in for a second meeting. And I think that's the key to, and often for this process, that transition from, if you like, the theoretical to the practical and back again to the theoretical is, I think, a key part of what you do and a key part of, working in public policy.
Thank you, Greg. I think you've got some real great ways of even thinking about this for students. I love the 3 M's, for example, just thinking about what is their perspective. I think so many times at policy schools, you are taught to be the expert, not to think about what is the other person thinking about? What is putting yourself in other people's shoes? So I think that was really helpful. Thank you. We're going to take some questions that we have received, and I'm going to read them for you. Our first question is from Maggie Jones. We know her really well. And so she asks, the question is around change and contingency planning. And the question is, there has been so much change in our organization. She works for local government in the United States, but our higher ups are lukewarm about contingency planning because, in quotes, we're not there yet. How could we talk through the benefits of contingency planning and how can it be a helpful tool in times of change and may provide comfort rather than assumption that it will cause chaos? I'm going to throw in a second question that we have so that you can answer those 2 questions. Our second question comes from Cesar Nunez. We know him well too. In the slide on reciprocity, you mentioned the key principle, make sure everybody gets something. How do you evaluate that? And how do you be accountable as a public policy, allowing that everyone would get something different? So I'll stop there.
On that second question, I mean, thank you for the questions. They're both very, very pertinent. The on the second question about that accountability and how you make sure everybody gets something. The book is specifically about getting change through the inside of political institutions, but it applies, I think, to most sort of organizations. The thing about parliaments, which is where we do a lot of our work, is that they're very difficult to change for 3 reasons. The first is that there's never any one person in charge. I mean, if you take the Congress, for example, you will have a speaker, but the speaker only controls part of the institution. There's also an administrative part of the institution, and most of the power is always contested. And this is true of most parliaments, in that there's never one person in charge of the whole institution, because that's what democracy is for, to make sure that nobody is in absolute control. So it means that in order to get any change, you've got to negotiate. There's a good book by a guy called Eric Schickler about the evolution of the Congress called Disjointed Pluralism, looking at how the Congress has changed over the last century or so. And what he points out is that, the change that tends to emerge is a product of negotiation. It's ultimately nobody gets exactly what they want. So if you're going to try and change an institution where nobody's in charge, but secondly, I mentioned there were 3 points. So first, there's nobody in charge. Secondly, every politician will have an opinion about how the institution needs to change or not. And thirdly, and perhaps most significantly, they've all got a vote on it as well. In order to get that sort of change through that sort of institution, it often has to be put to the floor on a vote. So the process of getting change to happen is one of constant negotiation and trading stuff off. And most of the change which happens in that process of negotiation, nobody gets exactly what they want, but you have to be willing to trade off some of what you want in order to get most of what you want. But the key thing, and the book sort of makes this point, is that everybody has to feel ultimately that you're gaining more than you're losing. And what I argue in the book is that sort of change, rather than taking one reform at a time, it's far better to bundle several reforms together so that you have a chance of maximizing the number of winners and minimizing the number of losers. And that accountability, that understanding that negotiation is an internal political process. Ultimately, if some people feel that they are losing out, it's because of that negotiating process. But the key to successful reform, the sorts of stuff that you do and that we do, is to try and make sure that the vast majority of people feel that they are net beneficiaries rather than losers from that process of reform. So that's the point I'm making. On the first point about contingency and change, I'm not sure I entirely got exactly what the question was, but I think the key thing, it sounded like it was to do with people at the top not taking some of these issues seriously enough. And I think the problem as you go up organizations, Obama in his memoir, one of the insightful things he said is that by the time you're president, you don't get any easy decisions. Anything that's easy to decide is filtered out at a lower stage. It's only the really thorny stuff which happens. And there's a couple of quotes I use in the book for the start of different sections. One is from the famous Bismarck quote that politics is the art of the possible, the attainable, the next best. And that's fine. But the very end of the book, the last short chapter, starts with a quote from J.K. Galbraith, the economist who worked as an advisor to Kennedy when he was president. And in one of the notes he sent to Kennedy, he said Bismarck was wrong. Politics is not the art of the possible. It's about choosing between the unpalatable and the disastrous. And that's more to do with the reality of politics. By the time you get to that stage, if you're at a senior level, it's not often that it's just about getting you're trying to get the best outcome. It's often that there are no good choices face you. You are choosing between the unpalatable and the disastrous, and you just need to do the least worst thing rather than the best thing. And that's the challenge you're often facing. So I'm not sure I'm answering the Maggie's question particularly well, but I mean, I think in terms of those issues of trying to convince the higher ups, it's understanding again, well, what are the other choices that they are facing here? What are the trade-offs they are having to make, and how do you make the case that this is going to be both a logical and a rational solution, that it's going to solve a short-term problem, which is probably what they're facing, as well as a long-term problem, which is it sounds like the contingency issue which she's raising there. But I'm happy to have that question clarified and try and come back again.
No, I think she said you're doing great. Thank you. That's direct quote. Yeah, just thinking about the least worst option. And again, putting yourself in their shoes. Why are they fighting this? What is their interest? What are they possibly worried about? I think your earlier point on loss aversion is something that we take very seriously as well. And it's one of the reasons why we do say change is hard, is it's always loss aversion and just trying to figure out the risks. And as you go higher in the chain, the risks are higher. And I love your President Obama's quote on you only get the worst thing. So the risks just increase, sometimes exponentially, as you go above the chain. And that can help people understand. I have a final question from the chat. And this question is from Lacey Jeffries. And the question is it possible to discuss change and reforms in an environment where zero-sum thinking, sorry, it just jumped. Where zero-sum thinking dominates, how do you help people with the zero-sum mindset shift it to make space for change that benefits everyone? I think that's a great question to end with.
Yeah, I mean that really, I mean, it's a good. If that's the last question, it's a good question to finish on because that's sort of at the heart of the book. And the first part of the book it talks about how organizations function, how norms evolve, and it uses my experience of working in Iraq and Libya and Egypt, where they were trying to create institutions where there were no norms, where there were no, accepted ways of working, and trying to get, leaving aside the political divides, the fact that each of those countries had, gone through a revolution or fighting, there was a huge political divide there, but equally none of them. But also, none of the politicians coming in had any agreement about how the institution should function, what it was for, what they were there to do. And Libya, in many ways, was the most extreme version of zero-sum politics I have ever encountered. There was no trust anywhere between any of the politicians. And if you've got no trust, it's impossible to negotiate. Now, the point I make in the book is that you need. I also refer to Robert Axelrod's book, the title of which has now completely escaped me. It'll come back to me. Which is about reciprocity and behavior and how you move away from zero sum thinking. But the key is you need to build enough trust for people to be willing to trade stuff off between them. You need the people who are going to negotiate the process of change in order to get away from zero sum thinking need to believe that the other people on the other side also you need to find the commonality. There's an example I use from Somaliland, which did go through a process of constitutional rupture and has largely been sort of stable over the last 20 years. And they were able to negotiate this very fractured process through in a successful in a way which was more successful than many other countries who've gone through something similar. One of the key facets of that was that many of the people who were negotiating with each other on different sides of the political divide had been to the same school together. So even though they fundamentally disagreed with each other, they had a basis from which at least to negotiate. And it's building that basis for negotiation, that working out where the commonalities are to start with. That's the only way you can start to get away from that zero sum thinking where if you're gaining, then I must be losing. There needs to be some sense of reciprocal exchange and the book talks a lot about reciprocal altruism, which is another interesting concept which we don't have time to go into, but that's the key. It's building that basis for negotiation, enough trust at least that you're trusting the people on the other side to deliver on what they're going to say they're going to deliver, and that you have some commonality of interest, no matter how small it is to start with, when you build outwards from there.
Wonderful, thank you. I mean, trust is really key, and building that from commonality is really great. The former governor of Massachusetts tells a great story of how he grew up in a household where his one parent was Republican and the other one was Democrat, and he really learned that that's the only way, is finding common ground. And he said, we always can. It may take a day or two, but you can always find common ground because we are all, coming back to your real key point, is we are all human. And that is something that binds us all. We all die, for
The
example.
actual on that theme, Salima, the book has now come back to me. It's The Evolution of Cooperation by Robert Axelrod, which is a cracking book. I'm sure you're aware of it, but I would highly recommend it for describing exactly what you've just described there.
Yeah, that's great. Well, what a wonderful way to end this. This has been really informative and very helpful. I'm sure even those who are not here will be able to watch the recording and get a lot of, at least some insights on how they may think about doing things differently. Thank you so much, Greg. It's been a delight.
My pleasure. Lovely to be with you. Hope to be with you physically at some point soon.
Definitely. We look forward to it.
Thanks very much.